Okay, so this is the third part of the 1950s unit. This is rebelling against conformity. So conformity, you can think of it as the same thing as like after World War One, you had Warren G. Harding calling for a return to what he called normalcy. So things are supposed to just fall back into place, go back to how they were before the war. And so at the beginning and the middle of the 1950s, conformity would have been the expectation in the United States, socially, politically, economically, across the board. And some examples of this include like young men and women, they were expected to go to high school, fall in love, get married to each other, and then have kids. And husbands and wives had defined roles. Um, Men worked out of the house, women were expected to stay in the home. Children were supposed to obey their parents and their teachers, and everything in the 50s was supposed to just be what they would have called super. So some people criticize this, though, this viewpoint. There's some pushback to this, and John Updike is one of those. He's a poet, and he wrote this poem called Superman, in which he says, I drive my car to the supermarket. The way I drive is super high. A super lot is where I park it, and super suds are what I buy. Super salesmen sell me tonic supertone zero for relief. The planes I ride are supersonic. In trains, I like the super chief. Supercilious men and women call me superficial me, who superbly learned to swim in supercausality. Superphosphate fed foods feed me. Super service keeps me new. Who would dare to supersede me? Super who? So Opdyke and others, what they're mocking is suburbia, the Levitt towns that we talked about before, and its promise to the American people that it was going to offer them a better life. And so people did move to the suburbs in huge numbers. This meant that the American cities, like Detroit, Chicago, New York, they didn't empty out. What happened is many of the people who could move out did, and that meant that cities are going to become places of greater disparity, meaning there will be more poor people there because they couldn't afford to move to the suburbs, and there will be more people of color concentrated in cities than in the suburbs because the suburbs specifically did not allow people of color to live there. That was part of their mortgage agreement. So by the 1960s, about a third of the American public is living in the suburbs. And there's criticisms of suburbia. And this gentleman, his name is Lewis Mumford, his description of the first Levitt town that was built in Long Island is as such. He says, quote, a multitude of uniform, unidentifiable houses lined up inflexibly at uniform distances on uniform roads in a treeless communal waste, inhabited by people of the same class, the same income, the same age group, witnessing the same television performances, eating the same tasteless, prefabricated foods from the same freezers, conforming in every outward and inward respect to a common mold. And then the sociologist William White, he offers a different view of the suburbs, but it's still critical. He saw them as being what he called packaged villages that have become the dormitory of a new generation of organization men. And these organization men were the employees of large corporations like, say, like IBM or Ford or GM, places like that, or government bureaucracies. And he continued to write, he said, quote, they are not the workers in the usual sense of the word. These people not only work for the organization, the ones I'm talking about belong to it as well. They are the ones in our middle class who have left home, spiritually as well as physically, to take the vows of organization life. So it's not just that you work for IBM, it's that you're an IBM man. That's your identity. And then the sociologist David Reisman, he attacked the culture of conformity that the suburbs were creating. And in his book, it's called The Lonely Crowd, he's writing that the middle class suburban child is learning to conform to the group almost as soon as they learn anything, like to speak or ride a bike or anything. And such children that they grow up valuing fitting in with their peers over thinking for themselves or striving for individual achievement. So they're conforming, and this is a problem. The television, it drew the greatest deal of criticism because at the beginning of the 50s, the TV, it brought like works of art. So you could turn on the television and you could see like Shakespearean plays, there were concerts, and in general, the television programs that were being provided in the early 1950s, these were regarded as having some sort of artistic quality or some value anyways. But by the 60s, most of the television shows were just viewed as popular entertainment, and they had little or no artistic value whatsoever. So some people, they gave the television the nickname the idiot box because people would just sit there in front of it and watch it. People were eating in front of the TV. You had TV dinners. You had people who would sit on the couch or in their chairs with trays. And this is a change because most people would sit around the kitchen table and eat. And that this changes that. And then instead of having conversations like with your father or mother or your kids, instead you're just watching TV. The poet T.S. Eliot, he dismissed television. He called it a medium of entertainment which permits millions of people to listen to the same joke at the same time and yet remain lonesome. So now there are people though that will defend suburbia. So for example, the people that lived there, they felt that these attacks against suburbia and against themselves was unfair, and they countered that there was actually a great degree of diversity in the suburbs. In most suburbs, though, like I said, they're completely devoid of African Americans or any people of color, Mexican, Asian, by design. And there are, though, differences, and those differences are found in terms of religion, meaning you've got Christians, Jews, with the Christians, you've got Protestants and Catholics living by each other. And then ethnically, people are different. So your neighbor could be Italian, and then the neighbor across the street could be Polish. So there's the ethnic difference. And this is important because we had talked about this before at the beginning of the year, actually, where we said that people who came from Europe tended to live in ghettos, which was, there was an Italian ghetto, there was a Jewish ghetto, there was a Polish ghetto. Well, that's no longer necessarily the case. And there's a great variety, if you want to call it great, of political views in the suburbs where you've got Democrats, you've got Republicans, you've got people who are in between. There's all kinds of examples of different people here. So are the people living in the suburbs wrong? Is there like no diversity? Well, yeah, there is, but it's not the level of diversity that would necessarily be expected. So other people, they argued that, what the suburbs provided was the ability to buy your own home, and that meant that you had a private world in which to live and raise your kids. And that was something that was just not possible in the cities because cities couldn't continue to grow outward. They had grown instead vertically. And so people lived in apartments. That wasn't the case out in the suburbs. Now, the historian James Patterson, he states that the post-war Americans, they were not more materialistic than earlier generations, just they were incomparably richer, that they were able to buy and enjoy things that their parents could only dream about. And if you think about it, people in the 50s who live in homes, their parents were raising their children during the Great Depression and the Second World War. They didn't have these goods to buy. For one thing, in the Depression, they wouldn't have had money to buy them. And then during the war, the majority of the goods that were being manufactured in the United States were for war purposes. There weren't televisions and radios and things like that being built and sold. Now, one of the things that changes greatly is music, and specifically with the introduction of rock and roll. So this is a new style of music in the 50s, and it was greatly feared by parents. What it is it grows out of this mixture of rhythm and blues and country, and it's where white artists popularized black styles of music. There's a whole history of this where there was a white DJ who overheard some music being played at a record shop, asked what it was, played it at his radio station, and like the phone was going off the hook. People just couldn't get enough of it, and this caught the attention of these disc jockeys. And what they did was they hired white artists to sing these songs of black artists. So the person who comes to epitomize the 1950s rock and roll period is Elvis Presley, and that's him there on the right. Now, adults at the time would mock him. They called him Elvis to pelvis because of the way that he would dance. He would gyrate his pelvis and things, and it was like considered to be a sexually suggestive way of dancing if they only knew what was coming, right? But the young people, they loved him because he represented like a rebelliousness that they craved, and they wanted to be able to identify, the teens of the time wanted to be able to identify themselves as something other than what their parents were. This also is seen in the movies. Hollywood studios, they saw that there was a restlessness in the American teens, and so they made movies specifically designed to cater to them. So they would have actors who could portray these like moody, angsty expressions, and how they're misunderstood by the adults. And so on the top right here, This is James Dean in the movie Rebel Without a Cause, in which gives this intense portrayal of this brooding young misfit who just can never fit in. Things have changed. It's a very good movie. You should check it out. And then you've got the wild one, and here's Marlon Brando. He's this rebellious motorcycle gang leader, and at one point in the film, a girl asks him like, "What's he rebelling against?" And his sneering answer back to her is, "What do you got?" So it's like anything and everything. The language of the time is interesting too, because the teens, they begin to develop their own language so that they can speak amongst themselves and not have to worry about what they would call the big daddies. That's the older generation understanding them. And so they have new terms. So they came up with the word boss, which meant like something is great, or threads, which is a person's clothes. If a person is popular, they're deemed to be radioactive. And then other terms like cool it and don't have a cow. These are all slang that were made popular in the 50s. The comic books are interesting because in the 30s and the 40s they featured heroes like Superman and Batman, and they were overcoming the bad guy. And then in the 50s, though, some of the comics that were being published, they really veered to a different place, a much darker place. And so you've got new series that were created like crime suspense stories, Tales from the Crypt, and the frontline combat. And what's different about these versus earlier comic books is they're a lot more gruesome and they're a lot more violent. Mad, not Mad Magazine, because it's not Mad Magazine yet, it's just called Mad. They poked fun at everything. There was nothing that they would not go after, including like other comic books, what was popular on TV, U.S. foreign policy, espionage, and all kinds of things. Now, the psychologist Frederick Worthman in 1954, he writes this book called The Seduction of the Innocent, and he complained that the values such as trust, loyalty, confidence, solidarity, sympathy, charity, and compassion, that they're ridiculed in comic books. And he argued that comics had become how-to books for future criminals. And he said, or he wrote, quote, "If one were to set out to show children how to steal, rob, lie, cheat, assault, and break into houses, no better method could be devised." Interestingly, if you look this guy up, he actually makes the claim that like Hitler was bad, but comic books are worse, which really, really understands how terrible Nazism was. But many parents at the time, though, they actually agree with Dr. Worthman, and they see comics as being a threat to the American way. If your kid is getting into trouble at school, what's the cause of it? Well, it's because they're reading comic books. So the comic book publishers respond to this, though, because they realize that if they don't do something, then Congress is going to step in and potentially censor them. So they create this thing called the Comics Code Authority. And what this organization does is they'll screen, meaning they'll read comics before they're published, and they'll look to make sure that they are complying with the comic code. And the comic code did things like it prohibited descriptions of gore, sexuality, and excessive violence. And it's a requirement that good must always triumph over evil. And you could get around this, though, because like Mad, what they did was they changed from being Mad comic to being Mad magazine. So they were not subject to the comic code authority. Then there's this group of young men and women called the Beatniks. They rejected any form of convention. So they didn't live at home. They didn't have regular jobs. Their goal was not to get married and have kids. And they just mocked the senselessness and the dryness of traditional living. And they wrote extensively, and they lived lives of travel, adventure, spirituality, and they wrote about the stories of their journeys with their friends, etc. And so one such person is this gentleman here. His name is Jack Kerouac, and this is from his work On the Road Again. He writes, quote, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars. And in the middle, you see the blue center light pop, and everything goes, oh." You can go to YouTube and like look up Beatniks and like listen to their works read aloud by them. It's pretty interesting. Lastly, we have artists. They also rebel, and they do so with paint. So the artists of the 50s, they come up with a new form of art expression called abstract expressionism. And it's abstract because it doesn't really, there's no recognizable objects being depicted per se. So like you don't see the Eiffel Tower, even if it's called the Eiffel Tower or something like that. and instead, what it is it's drippings and paintbrushes, and it's supposed to evoke some sort of an emotional response, both from the artist and from the viewer themselves. Many people would criticize this at the time and say that people like this guy right here, this is Jackson Pollock, the most famous of the abstract expressionists. They would say that he was a dripper, that this isn't real artwork, that like a dog could do this. If today you find one of these things, they're very, very valuable. And if you look at it, if you go to like the Detroit Institute of Arts and you view some of these things, the point is you're not looking at a landscape. What you're looking at is something emotional, and it's supposed to stir something inside of you. All right, so we have covered a couple of things now. So we've covered the political part of the 50s, the life and culture of the 50s, and then the reaction against the 1950s. So what I would like you to do for an assignment is I would like you to pick a part of the 1950s life and culture. So not the political part, but like the previous video or this video. And I would like you to tell me what's you found the most interesting, and then why did you find it the most interesting. Now, it doesn't have to be from both videos. It just has to be from one. You can do more than one, that's fine, but it has to be at least one. I'm looking for 2 to 3 sentences. Put it on a Google Doc, attach it to this assignment, and then turn it in. All right, you guys have a great week. Have a good Easter too. Bye.